I'm recording this on a Vox unit that shouldn't still function, speaking into a microphone caked with something that used to be part of my hand. My ears stopped bleeding 3 days ago, or maybe 3 hours. Time moves strangely when you can hear everything at once, when sound has become the only sense that matters, and it's telling you things that unravel the architecture of sanity. My name was Sergeant Dominic Thale, 47th Cadian Regiment, Communications Specialist, 23 years of service, distinguished by the fact that I never once missed a transmission or lost a Vox link in combat. I was the man who kept the words flowing, who maintained the invisible threads that connected command to infantry, artillery to eyes, strategy to execution. I lived in a world of frequencies and filters, of signal clarity and noise suppression, of clean channels cutting through the chaos of war. That expertise means nothing now. Worse than nothing, it made me the perfect victim, the ideal subject for what happened on the defense line at Tertius Hive when the noise marine came to play. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what I was before I can explain what I've become, and you need to understand sound before you can comprehend what sound becomes when the ruinous powers twist it into a weapon of transformation. I was born with what the Medicae called hyperacute auditory processing, a genetic quirk that meant I could distinguish between frequencies most humans heard as identical, could parse individual conversations in crowded rooms, could detect the subtle whine of a Vox unit failing before the static began. It made me invaluable as a communications specialist. It also meant that 23 years of wearing Vox equipment, of bathing my eardrums in compressed radio waves and amplified signals, had changed my neural pathways in ways I didn't understand until much, much too late. The defense of Tertius Hive began like 1,000 other defensive actions I'd participated in: chaos, cultists, and renegade. Guard elements probing our lines, testing our strength, looking for weakness. We were dug in along the industrial sector's perimeter, 3,000 men holding a line that should have required 10,000, stretching ourselves thin because Tertius was the 17th priority in a subsector with 20 active war zones. My position was the command bunker's Vox chamber, a reinforced room 20 meters below the surface, where I managed communications for 6 company commanders, 2 artillery batteries, and a squadron of sentinel walkers. The room was my domain, my sanctuary: thick walls that muted external noise, equipment racks that hummed with familiar frequencies, cogitators that chattered in machine code I'd learned to parse like language. The first sign that something was different came on the 3rd day of the siege. I was monitoring the standard traffic request for ammunition resupply from 4th Company, casualty reports from 2nd, artillery ranging calculations from the fire control center when I heard it. A sound underneath the sound. A frequency that shouldn't have existed, playing in harmonics that had no business occurring in natural physics. It was brief, maybe 2 seconds, buried under Captain Merrick's voice as he reported enemy movement in Sector 7. But I heard it clearly, a note that made my teeth ache and my vision blur, that tasted like copper and smelled like burning roses, that created sensory confusion in ways I couldn't articulate. I flagged it, ran the recording through spectral analysis. The cogitator found nothing. Clean signal, no interference, no harmonic distortion. But I'd heard it. I knew I'd heard it. I mentioned it to Lieutenant Voss, my immediate superior, and he gave me the look veterans give to soldiers who are starting to crack, sympathetic but wary, making a mental note to watch for further signs of stress-induced breakdown. I didn't push it. In the Imperial Guard, you learn when to let things go, when questioning your own perception is safer than questioning reality. The sound came again 6 hours later, this time during a lull in communications, when I was monitoring the ambient channels for any sign of enemy Vox traffic. 3 seconds. Longer. Complex. It started as a whisper, rose to something like singing, dropped into frequencies so low I felt them in my chest rather than heard them. And this time I noticed something else. The sound made patterns in the static on my screens, not random interference, but geometric shapes that pulsed in rhythm with the audio. mandalas of white noise that expanded and contracted like breathing. I should have reported it to the commissariat. Should have requested immediate psychic screening for demonic influence. But I didn't, and I still don't fully understand why. Perhaps because the sound was beautiful. Not in the way imperial hymns are beautiful, with their rigid structures and martial cadences. Beautiful the way a fever dream is beautiful, with logic that makes perfect sense inside the dream but evaporates upon waking. I wanted to hear it again, wanted to understand its structure. I began dedicating cycles of my duty shift to searching for it, scanning through recorded transmissions, listening to the spaces between words where the sound seemed to hide. I found it in Lieutenant Harrow's last transmission before he died. He was screaming about something in the trenches, something that was making his men's bones vibrate out of their skins, and under his screaming I heard it. The sound, clearer now, more insistent, almost playful. It was there in the background of Corporal Jan's frantic report about soldiers whose eardrums had exploded, but who kept standing, kept moving, kept fighting with bleeding holes where their ears should be. It was present in the strange distortion that corrupted Sergeant Malek's request for flamer fuel. His words stretched and compressed, like he was speaking through liquid time. The pattern became clear on the fourth day. Every transmission from the eastern sectors where the fighting was heaviest, where the cultists were pushing hardest, contained traces of the sound. And every soldier who spent more than an hour in those sectors came back changed. Subtle changes at first, trouble sleeping, complaints about persistent ringing, requests to speak louder because everything sounded muffled. Then more dramatic. Soldiers who claimed they could hear the enemy approaching before the auspex detected them, who said they could identify individual cultists by the sound of their breathing, who began describing the battlefield in terms of auditory landscapes rather than visual ones. The Medicae flagged 17 cases of spontaneous tympanic rupture, 14 cases of unexplained temporal lobe hemorrhaging, 9 soldiers who'd gone completely deaf but claimed they could still hear just differently in frequencies that normal ears couldn't process. The medical staff was baffled. The commissars were suspicious. I was terrified because I recognized the symptoms. They were experiencing what I'd been experiencing, just accelerated, intensified. Whatever was causing the sound was learning, adapting, getting better at its craft. Then the noise marine announced himself. Not through the Vox, he didn't need radio to project his voice. He simply began to play, and every ear within 2 kilometers heard him perfectly, as if he were whispering directly into our skulls. The sound started at 0347 hours, shattering the pre-dawn quiet with a single sustained note that lasted for 47 seconds. It wasn't loud at first. That was the horror of it. It was gentle, almost tender, a tone that resonated somewhere between a human voice and a musical instrument, between organic and synthetic, between sound and something that used sound as a vehicle for more complex transmission. In the Vox chamber, I watched my equipment come alive. Every screen showed the same thing: waveforms that shouldn't be possible, frequencies that violated the physical limitations of the audio spectrum, harmonics that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The cogitators tried to process what they were receiving and failed, their machine spirits howling in electronic distress. And the sound continued, building on itself, adding layers, a melody that had structure but no pattern I could recognize, rhythm that followed rules I didn't understand. Then he spoke. The noise marine. His voice came through every Vox unit simultaneously, bypassing encryption, override protocols, even the most sacred command channels. "I am Valsarian the Symphonist," he said, and his voice was wrong. Not distorted, not corrupted, perfect. Too perfect. Each syllable was precisely formed, occupying exactly the correct frequency, creating harmonics that made my brain light up with activity in regions that should never activate during auditory processing. "I have come to perform for you, to share my art, to show you what sound can become when it transcends the limitations of crude meat interpretation." The first casualties came 30 seconds after he finished speaking. Soldiers in the forward trenches began screaming, clawing at their ears, smashing their heads against bunker walls. The screaming head structure was, in fact, harmonizing with Valsarian's residual frequencies, creating new patterns, new layers of meaning. I listened to them die over the Vox, their death sounds contributing to some vast composition I could sense but not comprehend. And I realized something that filled me with a horror worse than any I'd experienced in 2 decades of warfare. He wasn't killing them. He was recruiting them, transforming their death cries into instruments, adding their voices to his symphony. The assault began in earnest at dawn. Cultists and renegades poured into our lines, but they were accompaniment, backup singers. The real attack was sonic. Valsarian played his instruments weapons that were also musical instruments, or musical instruments that were also weapons. The distinction had become meaningless, and reality bent around the sound. Last rounds changed trajectory mid-flight, following acoustic curves instead of ballistic paths. Grenades detonated in rhythms that created percussion patterns. Artillery shells screamed as they fell, their whistling tones precisely calibrated to shatter not just flesh, but morale, cognition, sense of self. I watched it all through the Vox network, heard it through 100 dying soldiers' reports. Sound became visible in the battlefield, smoke shockwaves that looked like wings, frequencies that painted themselves in the air as colors that had no names. Valsarian moved through our lines like a conductor before an orchestra, and everything he touched began to sing. Bulkheads vibrated with new voices, weapons fired to new rhythms. Even the ground itself seemed to resonate, turning the battlefield into a vast instrument. In the Vox chamber, I should have been safe. 20 meters of rockcrete between me and the surface, sound-dampening materials in the walls, hermetically sealed hatches. But sound doesn't respect barriers when it becomes something more than physics. I felt it seeping through the walls, like liquid, like prayer, like infection. My equipment began to malfunction in new ways, screens showing images they shouldn't be capable of displaying, speakers producing sounds in frequencies they weren't designed to generate. The machine spirits were being corrupted, taught to process information in ways that violated their sacred programming. And I was changing too. The persistent tinnitus I'd lived with for years, the price of decades of Vox work, began to modulate, to acquire structure. What I'd always heard as meaningless ringing resolved into notes, into chords, into fragments of a melody that seemed to be playing from inside my own skull. My hyperacute auditory processing, that genetic gift that had made me so valuable, was adapting to the new acoustic environment, learning to pass frequencies that human ears weren't designed to hear. Lieutenant Voss came to the Vox chamber on the second day of Valsarian's performance. He looked grey, haggard, aged 20 years in 48 hours. "We're pulling back," he said, consolidating to the inner defense line. "You need to pack up what equipment is still functional and prepare to relocate." I nodded, but I was only half listening. The rest of my attention was focused on a transmission I was receiving, except I wasn't receiving it through the Vox equipment. I was receiving it directly. My auditory cortex picking up Valsarian's broadcast without the intermediary of machinery. He was playing something new, a piece that incorporated the sounds of our retreat. The rumble of tanks pulling back, the crack of buildings collapsing, the screams of soldiers who couldn't disengage because they'd been frozen by sonic paralysis. It was magnificent. I understood that word's full meaning for the first time, terrible and beautiful in proportions that made the distinction meaningless. "Thale?" Voss's voice seemed distant, distorted, less real than the symphony playing in my head. "Sergeant, are you listening to me?" "Yes, sir," I said automatically, preparing to relocate. But I wasn't preparing. I was listening. I'd discovered something. If I focused correctly, if I tuned my perception just right, I could hear individual components of Valsarian's composition, could identify which sounds were coming from his primary weapon, some kind of sonic cannon that fired notes instead of projectiles, and which were being generated by his armor, his movements, his presence. He was a walking orchestra, every part of him contributing to the music. And more than that, he was conducting, shaping the battlefield's acoustic environment, guiding the sounds of battle into patterns that served some purpose I was beginning to grasp. He was teaching. Every note, every rhythm, every harmonic progression was a lesson in how sound could transcend its role as mere vibration and become a force of transformation. And we, the defenders of Tertius Hive, were his students, whether we wanted to be or not. Every soldier who heard his music and survived came away changed, their neural pathways rewired, their perception expanded into frequencies they'd never accessed before. We were being optimized for a new kind of hearing, made into receivers for transmissions that normal human consciousness couldn't process. The retreat was chaos set to music. Valsarian followed us, playing constantly, and the sound of his pursuit was almost gentle. He wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to overwhelm us through sheer volume or force. He was savoring it, treating our destruction as a kind of performance art where every element had to be perfect, every note precisely placed. I heard him clearly now, his voice coming through not just the Vox equipment but through the walls, through the air, through my bones. Run if you must. The composition benefits from contrast. Quiet moments make the crescendo more effective. Fear adds texture. Desperation provides rhythm. You are all contributing beautifully. We reached the inner defense line at dusk. Consolidated, counted casualties, assessed damage. We'd lost 40% of our strength. The remainder showed signs of progressive auditory corruption, bleeding ears, perforated eardrums, hemorrhaging in the temporal and frontal lobes. The commissariat executed 16 soldiers for displaying symptoms consistent with chaos taint. The executions were quick, professional, necessary. But I heard something the commissars didn't. The soldiers died in perfect harmony, their last gasps creating intervals that shouldn't occur naturally, their falling bodies making sounds that contributed to the larger composition. Even in death, they were still performing. I tried to explain this to Lieutenant Voss, tried to make him understand that Valsarian wasn't just killing us, he was incorporating us into something larger, teaching us to hear in ways that transcended human limitations. Voss stared at me for a long moment, his hand drifting toward his sidearm, and I saw him making the same calculation the commissars had made with those 16 soldiers. Then he lowered his hand and said, very carefully, "Get some rest, Sergeant. That's an order." I didn't rest. Couldn't rest. The music wouldn't stop. Even in the rare moments when Valsarian wasn't actively playing, I could hear echoes, reverberations, the ghostly after-impressions of sounds that had transcended their moment of creation. The Vox chamber had become an acoustic nightmare, every surface vibrating with residual frequencies, every piece of equipment contributing to an ambient symphony that nobody else seemed to hear. Or perhaps they heard it, but their minds refused to process it, protecting them from understanding through willful ignorance. I began to experiment. If I was receiving Valsarian's transmissions directly, perhaps I could transmit back. I spoke into the Vox units, trying to shape my words into patterns that would carry meaning beyond mere semantics, trying to communicate with him in the language of pure sound. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before midnight on the third day, he answered me, not with words, with a cascade of tones that hit my auditory cortex like a physical impact, that conveyed more information in 3 seconds than an hour-long briefing could contain. He was pleased with me. I understood that immediately, the way you understand emotions in dreams without needing explicit explanation. He'd been watching me, listening to me, hearing how my neural patterns adapted to his broadcasts more efficiently than any other defenders. I was his prize student, his most responsive audience, and he had plans for a distributed intelligence that used sound as both medium and message, that existed in vibration rather than meat. When he finally stopped singing, I wasn't Dominic Thale anymore. Not entirely. I was something new, something that retained his memories and personality but had been fundamentally restructured around different principles. I could still see, still touch, still taste, but those senses were distant, muffled, less real than hearing. Sound was reality now. Everything else was just context. irrelevant data from secondary sensory systems. "Stand up," Valsarian said, and I obeyed. My body felt strange, foreign, a clumsy vehicle for consciousness that now existed primarily in acoustic space. "Tell me what you hear." I listened, heard the dying sounds of the hive above us, the last defenders being hunted down, the buildings collapsing, the flames consuming everything. Heard the cultists singing their praises to Slanesh, their voices raw and desperate and beautiful in their conviction. Heard the planet itself groaning under the weight of war, tectonic plates grinding together, magma flowing through deep channels, the slow, patient growth of crystals in buried rock. Heard the warp bleeding through the veil, daemons screaming in frequencies that would drive unmodified humans instantly mad. And I heard Valsarian's music continuing, still playing, still teaching. He'd never stopped. The battle itself was his composition, every death a note, every scream a phrase, the entire war, a symphony that would eventually end in some great crescendo of meaning that I couldn't yet comprehend but could sense approaching. "I hear everything," I said, and my voice came out wrong-modulated, harmonized, containing frequencies that I was unconsciously adding. "I hear the music of existence, the fundamental frequency, the drone beneath reality." "Good." He sounded pleased, proud. "You're the first one on this world who truly understood. The others they heard, but they didn't comprehend. They felt the beauty but couldn't articulate it. But you have the vocabulary, the training. 23 years of communications work gave you the framework to understand what I'm teaching." He gestured around the Vox chamber, at the equipment that was now singing softly, harmonizing with his presence. "This is my gift to you, and my burden. You will carry my music forward. When this world falls, and it will fall, the composition demands that you will survive. You will find your way to other Imperial worlds, other defensive lines, other soldiers who spend their lives listening to Vox traffic, and you will teach them what I've taught you. You will help them here." "I don't want to," I said. But even as I spoke, the words I knew they were false. I wanted this desperately, had wanted it from the first moment I heard his underlying frequency in Captain Merrick's transmission. I wanted to share this gift, wanted to help others transcend the limitations of crude mechanical hearing and access the full spectrum of acoustic reality. "You don't have a choice," Valsarian said. "You're infected now, corrupted, changed beyond recovery. The Imperium would execute you on sight if they knew what you'd become, but they won't know. You look human still, sound human still, if you're careful. You can hide among them, work among them, slowly changing them one listener at a time. That's the true art, not the obvious corruption, but the subtle transformation, teaching them to hear just a little better, just a little deeper, until one day they realize they've been listening to frequencies their souls weren't designed to process." He moved toward the door, his presence making the air sing. "I'm leaving you the Vox equipment, all of it. It's already been tuned, modified. Every transmission that passes through it will carry traces of my music, fragments of the lesson, imperceptible to crude ears. But you'll know they're there, and so will others like you, others who are ready to hear." I wanted to stop him, wanted to beg him to stay, to continue teaching, to show me everything he knew about the acoustic dimensions of reality. But he was already gone, moving on to other battles, other performances, other students who needed his violent instruction. And I was left alone in the Vox chamber with singing equipment and a head full of frequencies that shouldn't exist. The Imperial Reclamation Force arrived 2 weeks later. They found me in the ruins of the command bunker, surrounded by Vox equipment that seemed to be functioning far better than it should, given the level of damage the structure had sustained. I told them I'd survived through luck and the Emperor's grace. They believed me because they wanted to believe me, because the alternative that I'd been spared by the enemy for a reason was too horrible to acknowledge. They gave me a commendation, promoted me, assigned me to a new regiment with state-of-the-art communications equipment that I immediately began to adjust. Nothing obvious, just small changes to the frequency response, minor modifications to the signal processing, subtle alterations that wouldn't be noticed by anyone who wasn't listening carefully. But the changes were there, and they had effects. Soldiers who used my Vox equipment started reporting tinnitus, started hearing things in the static, started developing the same hyper-acute auditory processing that I'd been born with. I'm on my 43rd assignment now. 5 years since Tertius Hive. I've served on 17 different worlds, worked with 33 different regiments, trained 47 communications specialists who showed particular aptitude for frequency discrimination. Some of them have gone on to train others. The infection is spreading, propagating through the Imperium's communications networks, one Vox operator at a time. And none of them know. They think they're just getting better at their jobs, developing natural skills, experiencing the normal consequences of long-term Vox equipment exposure. But I know the truth. I can hear it in their transmissions, the subtle harmonics that indicate their neural restructuring, the frequencies they're starting to process without realizing it, the slow, patient growth of new sensory organs in their temporal lobes. They're all becoming what I became. Receivers for frequencies that the Imperium doesn't acknowledge exist. Listeners for music that will eventually teach them to transcend the limitations of loyal service and crude biological hearing. This recording will be my last as Sergeant Dominic Thale. I'm being reassigned again, promoted to training command at the Vox Operator Academy on Cadia. Thousands of new communications specialists cycle through that facility every year, and I'll have access to all of them. We'll be able to shape their education, teach them proper technique, ensure that every graduate leaves with equipment that's been carefully tuned to broadcast Valsarian's underlying frequency. The Imperium thinks it's fighting chaos at its borders, on distant worlds where the enemy is obvious and external. They don't realize the war is already inside, transmitted through every Vox channel, carried in every communication, spreading through the invisible networks that hold their vast empire together. We're teaching them to hear better, teaching them to process frequencies their minds weren't designed for, teaching them that sound is more than vibration, it's transformation, evolution, transcendence. Valsarian never needed to conquer Tertius Hive. He'd already won the moment I heard that first harmonic underneath Captain Merrick's voice. He'd already won the moment I chose to listen instead of report, to understand instead of resist. And the Imperium is losing now, slowly, one communications specialist at a time. Their own infrastructure turned into a transmission network for corruption that sounds exactly like loyalty. The volume was never turned up all at once. That would be obvious, resistible. Instead, it's being turned up gradually, imperceptibly, degree by degree, across decades. And by the time anyone realizes what's happened, it will be far too late. We'll all be listening to the same frequency, all hearing the same music, all transformed into perfect receivers for the lessons that Slanish's servants want to teach. I can hear them now. Millions of Vox operators across the Imperium, all carrying traces of Valsarian's modification, all slowly adapting, all developing new sensory capabilities that their commissars and commanders and medici can't detect. They sound beautiful, harmonizing, building towards some vast crescendo that I can sense approaching but can't yet understand. What happens when a noise marine turns up the volume? You don't notice. That's the secret, the real horror. The volume increases so gradually that you adapt without realizing you're adapting, transform without knowing you're transforming. And then one day you wake up and realize you can hear things you couldn't hear before, understand frequencies that shouldn't be comprehensible, process sound in ways that transcend human neurology. And by then it's far too late. You're already infected, already changed, already listening to music that's rewriting your consciousness note by note. The volume is always going up, has been going up since the first communications equipment was ever used. Will continue going up until every ear in the Imperium is tuned to frequencies that exist beyond the Emperor's light. This is my confession and my conversion. This is my warning and my celebration. The music is beautiful. The transformation is inevitable. And we are all learning to hear better, whether we want to or not. The volume is still increasing. Listen carefully. You might already notice the difference.